Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and thank you for your very thoughtful remarks before. They were edifying for the committee. Mr. Schiff, welcome, and thank you for your extremely hard work during this tough period. This statute is unfamiliar to most members of Congress, unfamiliar to most Americans, and it's a mysterious foreign world to most of us, the whole intelligence operation. So I just wonder if you would take me through it slowly so we can see exactly what the legal obligations are. And I'm just going to try to restate it to my own understanding and interrupt me when I'm not getting it right or you feel like we need to elaborate something, okay? So there's a statute that was adopted by Congress to protect whistleblowers in the intelligence community. And it gives them the opportunity to go to the Inspector General. The Inspector General then decides whether it is a credible report of a problem, and the Inspector General can determine whether there's an urgency to the problem. This problem can be a form of abuse of the law, it can be a crisis, it can be impropriety, it could be crime, it could be a whole number of different things. At that point, the Inspector General essentially rules on it and says whether it's credible and whether this is of an urgent nature. And then at that point, if the IG finds that, it is turned over to the Director of National Intelligence. And upon receipt, the Director of National Intelligence has 7 days within which to turn it over to your committee. How am I doing?
You're doing very well.
Okay, so all of that happened in this case. That is, there was a whistleblower who made a complaint about the President of the United States, thought it was urgent. The IG looked at it and said, this is credible and this is urgent. He turned it over to the Director of National Intelligence, who received it, but then 7 days came and went, and he refused to bring it to the House Committee on Intelligence. Is that right?
Yes, I think technically he authorizes the IG to provide it to the committee, so it's transmitted to us through the IG's office.
Okay, but he refused to authorize the transmission of it to Congress from the IG. Okay, so has this ever happened before?
It's never happened before.
In other words, have there been complaints before, or is this the first time?
There have been dozens of complaints before. This is the first complaint since the creation of the whistleblower statute and the creation of the Office of Director of National Intelligence that a complaint has ever been withheld from Congress for any reason.
Okay.
And I should say, and this is an important point, two things. One is the DNI has written to us to give his explanation for why he won't provide it. The DNI does not take issue with the urgency. The DNI essentially takes the position that after the Department of Justice weighing in, and maybe others, they would not answer the question about whether the White House has been weighing in with them, that they believe this is outside of the DNI's jurisdiction. Now, the Inspector General said in response, no, this is central to the DNI's jurisdiction. So there's no dispute about the urgency here.
So they don't dispute the authenticity or the credibility, and they don't dispute the urgency, they just say it's somehow outside the scope of the statute.
Yes, now it may be, if the public reports are correct, that they're taking the position that because the President is above the IG, that above the DNI, that it's not within the jurisdiction of the DNI because he's above the DNI, but if that were true, then it means the President is above anyone's jurisdiction. And you know, the other point I would make, Mr. Raskin, is the entire history of this whistleblower complaint process has been such that even when the Inspector General, in their investigation, determines that a complaint is not urgent or doesn't meet the criteria for whatever reason, that complaint has still been provided to the committee. And the whistleblower has still been given instructions how they can come directly to the committee because the statute presupposes that the Congress may take a different view of it. And so the entire history and practice has been, whatever the findings are, the complaint goes to Congress, because the whole point of the process is to give the whistleblower an avenue to come to Congress.
And so it goes to the representatives of the people, and in congressional wisdom, we've created a committee of experts to review this, and you're able to assess things for credibility, authenticity, urgency, the character of the complaint. Right?
Yes. Okay.
Is it true that the President called the whistleblower a traitor?
I believe the President said that and I'm paraphrasing here, whose country is this whistleblower really on the side of? which
Okay.
is an accusation along the lines of maybe this person
Okay.
is a
Are you aware that the president has brought any evidence forward either to your committee or to law enforcement about the whistleblower being an agent of a foreign government?
I'm not aware of anything like that. And
Okay.
you know, if I could also say, in terms of the president's comments on this, which I find also disturbing, he's been saying that everybody has seen the complaint. Now, the Congress hasn't seen the complaint. The intended recipient of the complaint has not seen the complaint. If the president is the subject of the complaint, and again, we don't know, the idea that people around the president's own lawyers may have seen the complaint and are using that in the same way, frankly, that the president's handpicked lawyers misrepresented the Mueller report. Now they're misrepresenting the complaint. There's a wholly other order of magnitude of problem going on.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Wenstrup, I have two questions for you. One is, you suggested that the director disagrees with the Inspector General's interpretation of the complaint, but what's the part of the statute that authorizes the Director of National Intelligence to use his disagreement with the Inspector General not to turn over the complaint within 7 days?
That's what I hope to find out Thursday.
Well, no, but what in the statute? I mean, we've got a copy of the statute here.
That's what I would like to find out Thursday, and maybe it's in another statute on which I'm not familiar. I don't know.
Okay.
And that's fair. There may be.
Okay.
I mean, I brought up the point before.
Yeah.
Is it the standard that the intelligence community is not engaged between conversations between two heads of
Okay,
state?
so let me ask you about that. You piqued my curiosity with that point.
Yeah.
Now, say this again. The question, and again, this world is unfamiliar to me. We don't have the benefit of being on the committee that you guys do. But you're saying if there's a conversation between two chiefs, two chiefs of government, two heads of state, that the statute has a silent exception that does not permit.
That's my question.
Okay, but the question you're asking is whether there is a silent or implied exception in the statute for someone who wants to report an emergency situation.
I've asked that question of someone who should know the answer, and I got no answer.
Yeah.
And when I did ask in a similar fashion.
Well, has this been asserted by the Director of National Intelligence that there's an exception for conversations between heads of state?
That's what I want to find out.
Well, where's the question coming from? I guess that's my issue. They didn't come back and say, it's day 7, we understand every other Director of National Intelligence has turned the complaint over to you. We're not going to do it because we read in invisible ink a provision in the statute to say if there's a conversation between two heads of state, we're not covered by it. I mean, where is it coming from?
Well, I'm glad you have the same question I do. Thank you.
Well, I actually don't have that question because I don't see it. I'm a mere lawyer. I read the statute. I don't see anything about that in there. So, I mean, it's a creative suggestion, but I think it's an irrelevant distraction from interpretation
Mr. Raskin,
of the statute.
then I should have been able to get an answer from someone who sits in the position to be able to determine that. And I got no answer. And when I did ask Director Brennan one time about a conversation between two heads of state, his only answer to me was, I'm not going to comment, I'm paraphrasing, and I can get the actual context, between a conversation between two heads of state. So here's someone, Central Intelligence Agency, who's not going to comment on a private conversation between two heads of state. Don't you have the same curiosity I have?
Oh, but I'm very curious about it. I just don't know if it's relevant to the issue at hand. And I can appreciate your frustration about the situation because this is a democracy. We govern. The Congress passes laws for everybody and everything, including intelligence, and the law is written for all of us. And this law seems to be very clear, right? I'm a strict textualist and originalist. This law says in 7 days, the Director of Intelligence, whether he loves the complaint, he hates the complaint, he rolls his eyes at the complaint, whatever it is, he turns it over to Congress. To you guys, it's about your authority. It's about our authority as the representatives of Congress. So I thank you guys for educating me on how this statute works, but I feel ever more determined that we've got to pass this resolution, and I too am glad that the Senate acted in a bipartisan way, and I hope if you guys have any changes you want to it, you suggest them so we can pass it in a bipartisan way in Congress. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mrs. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to continue what Mr. Woodard had talked about, and that is the difference between the two resolutions, the Senate resolution and this House resolution. And I read the Senate resolution. It's very simple. It basically says, it asks the whistleblower complaint be transmitted to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, and that the committees should be allowed to evaluate the complaint. That's it. Very simple. I think it's like one page. This resolution, however, has several places with disparaging language, you know, and I can read it out loud if you'd like. It says, whereas allegations of such unprecedented and highly inappropriate efforts by President Trump and the White House and other senior officials of the Trump administration too, and then it goes on to say all the terrible things that have been done. And so I guess I'm going to ask a question of Mr. Winstrup. Earlier today in this hearing, Mr. Schiff, Chairman Schiff, said something to the effect, I didn't write it down, but something to the effect, if the House Republicans don't agree with this resolution like the Senate Republicans agreed with the resolution, then the House Republicans must just not care enough about, you know, uncovering this complaint and having transparency. And in light of the fact that if we don't, you know, there are two different stark differences. The Senate resolution was very simple. Just said turn over the complaint and we'll evaluate it. This one goes on about disparaging different people. So in your opinion, is Mr. Schiff accurate in his statement when he said that about House Republicans?
Well, we do care, and that's why I'm here. And we care very significantly, and I don't think it's fair for anyone to try and cast aspersions on an entire party because you have a difference of opinion. And I agree with what you just said. If you really want to get to this, you could have done it in a way that just gets to the heart of the matter like the Senate did. And I think it's a good point to be made. And it's a shame that it's come forward like this. Again, who knows? After Thursday, we could maybe agree to have the same resolution the Senate has. But I think it's important for us to have that conversation with the Director of National Intelligence, as we have with the IG. And as I said in my statement, I can't imagine that it would just be okay if we only heard from the DNI and not the IG and ended there. I don't think, and I can't answer for Mr. Schiff, but I don't think that would have been adequate. I think it would be important that we hear from both parties involved with this so we can make intelligent decisions as we move forward in our role of oversight over this process.
Thank you. And, you know, to my fellow members, I just want to say, because several times you've said, all we want to get to is finding out about this complaint. Well, if that's all that you want to get to and you don't want to make a political statement, which you said this is not political, which I disagree with, then why all the disparaging language? Why all the attacks? Why don't you just make it simple like the Senate one and say, we want the information to go to the intelligence committees? And so really, if you really look at this and think about it, I hope that you'll realize this is political.
Chairman, may I respond?
Yes.
We're getting two different messages from my colleagues today. One from my colleague from the committee, who I presume is representing the ranking member here today. One from the ranking member of this committee, which is this resolution, indeed any resolution, is premature. We shouldn't have to take this up before the director comes in. So this isn't really about, oh, we like the Senate language better than the House language. No one on this committee, Democrat, Republican, has pointed anything in the House resolution that isn't true. You know, those comments you think are disparaging of the president are his words. Now, maybe you don't want to acknowledge his words, but I do think that it's important that if we're going to validate the whistleblower process, that we not stand silent when the president is attacking someone who is following the law and doing exactly what we would hope they would, which is show the courage to come forward. So I don't know what your message is here today. Is it, this is premature, there shouldn't be any, we disagree with the Senate in moving so quickly? Or is it, well, we would support this if you'd just written it differently? Because I'm hearing two very different things here. I suspect that the discomfort you're expressing with the language is really to mask the fact that you don't want this resolution, you don't want any resolution. And this is an effort to try to explain why your senators voted for this, but you're not. And if I'm wrong about that, then maybe I'm misinterpreting Dr. Wenstrup and Mr. Cole's comments, because it sounded to me like they thought that any resolution on this subject was premature.
Ms. Lesko?
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, yes, I do disagree with you, Mr. Schiff, on what Republicans think, and maybe Republicans can have two thoughts at the same time. But I want to clarify for the record, because you just said these were President Trump's own words and they're not disparaging. I mean, I doubt very highly, I know it's not true, that President Trump would say this. It says, whereas allegations of such unprecedented and highly inappropriate efforts by President Donald J. Trump and White House and other senior officials, President Trump did not say that. So I want to clear that for the record. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
I would only
I'm having trouble understanding what this is the particular paragraph on page 6 where it says, whereas allegations of such unprecedented and highly inappropriate efforts by President Donald Trump and White House and other senior officials of the Trump, you saying that President Trump didn't say that. They're not saying that President Trump said that. What they are saying in the paragraph above that, I heard with my own ears that the president called the whistleblower a political hack job and a partisan person. And I don't think that it's disparaging to call out what the president has said himself. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you. I wanted to thank Chairman Schiff for pointing out that so many of the objections being raised here today have to do with process and that we should wait and see some undefined time longer. As a member of House Judiciary for the past few months, I've become overly familiar with this administration's obstruction of criminal and congressional investigations using delay, diversion, and denial of the rule of law. We're now confronting a fresh, urgent, and credible threat to our national security, our elections, and our Constitution. So to paraphrase the great Barbara Jordan, I didn't come to D.C. to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of our Constitution. So I support this resolution and I yield back.
Mr. Morelli?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Mr. Schiff and the ranking member. I'm not an attorney and I'm not a national security expert, so I'm just trying to sort of understand this from the perspective of the people back home that I represent. Could you, Mr. Chair, walk me through why the Whistleblower Act was set up in the first place in the late 1900s?
Well, there are a number of whistleblower laws that pertain to different departments and agencies.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I should have been more explicit, related to the intelligence community, this particular section.
By comparison, I think the whistleblower laws pertaining to the IC are a more recent vintage, but they're still a couple decades old, and they were a recognition that the intelligence community employees and detailees are in a unique position in that they have access to classified information and they don't have other avenues to seek redress of wrongdoing. They can't go to the press without violating the law if it deals with classified information. So there needed to be a mechanism to be able to come to Congress. And the mechanism that Congress created was one in which the whistleblower goes not directly to Congress, but through the Inspector General to Congress. That they file a complaint and the Inspector General can review that complaint and do a preliminary analysis, and they have 2 weeks to do it. And then that complaint is referred by the IG to the DNI, and they have 1 week to review it, and then they shall transmit it to Congress. Now, they can include whatever comments they want. I believe it, I don't believe it, whatever, but they transmit it.
And so, thank you for that. The Inspector General, I gather, and please correct me, is put in place as, well, maybe not a neutral arbiter, but someone who is, I assume, expected to take the information and determine whether or not there's, I think the term is credible, credible evidence that the whistleblower's complaint has validity to it, and that the reason they exist is for that neutral observation. It'd be is that right?
Yes, the Inspector General, although appointed by President Trump, is a neutral party. They do their own independent legal analysis and factual analysis. They only have a couple weeks to do it, so they have to do it quickly. And after having done that, they found it both credible and urgent and meeting all the statutory requirements.
And the reason the Inspector General is there rather than the whistleblower taking it directly to the DNI is because the DNI could be complicit in this, or at least is an interested party. Is that correct?
I think that the reason why the language of the statute is mandatory, not permissive, the DNI shall transmit it, is if a
Well, let me, before I get to that, because that is important as well, the reason that the IG is the person who determines credible evidence and transmits to the Congress instead of the DNI, that extra step, is that because the DNI may be complicit in whatever the whistleblower is trying to communicate to the Congress?
Well, whether complicit or not complicit,
Or
if
interested?